wasn't a problem. And so I'm going to see a different doctor about some stomach issues and let them check and make sure that nothing's going on there. And so I appreciate everyone's understanding and being patient. And hopefully I'll be back running in normal in a few days. But it's extremely frustrating because I want to feel like myself and I don't. And but anyway, hopefully we can make it through and be all right on the other side. All right, 1 Kings 22. This is where we are. We finished off with Ahab last week. Ahab, the prediction of his death once again, the great scene that Micaiah portrays in heaven, that the prophets are lying to Ahab. And then we see the fulfillment of that prophecy. Of course, 3 times it was predicted that Ahab would die. And finally he does. And so where we pick up now is kind of 2 small brief statements about kings. King Jehoshaphat, which we met in the first part of the chapter, but we're going to be told a little bit more about him. And then Ahazah, who is the son of Ahab, who takes over, and we'll hear more about him in the first chapter of this book. And so as we think about this, remember that when we get to Jehoshaphat here in 41, verse 41, throughout the greater portion of 1 Kings, since the division, a lot of the emphasis has been upon the 10 northern tribes. From 13 and 14 on, and then a little bit of 14 and 15, you see some kings of Judah. And then from the middle of 15 all the way up until this point, the emphasis has been upon the northern tribes. Now, the reason for that is because they have been launched into idolatry by King Ahab and some of the others. Now, the 2 southern tribes, the reason why they haven't held center stage is because they had 2 pretty good kings in Asa and Jehoshaphat who kind of provoked them to be faithful to the Lord. And so there wasn't a lot of information on them given because this is about the rise and the ruin of Israel. We've already seen the rise, and we're down on the downward slope now, watching what's going to happen to them as they're taken into captivity in Assyria and Babylon, respectively. And so that's why we're just now hearing about Jehoshaphat. We'll see a small statement, a few verses about him, and then it will return to the northern kings again. And we'll watch their acceleration. All right, so let's begin looking at 41. It says, Jehoshaphat, the son of Asa, began to reign over Judah in the 4th year of Ahab, king of Israel. Okay, so we learned about Jehoshaphat only by name in 2 Kings 15, or 1 Kings 15, I should say. When Asa dies, it just says Jehoshaphat, his son, reigned in his place. We knew he took over, and then we met him in the first part of this chapter, but we don't have a lot of information about him. And I think we mentioned last week that in the Chronicles, in 2 Chronicles, you read a lot about Jehoshaphat. And we talked about how the Chronicles focus only on the kings of Judah, okay? So that's why you'll see more information there. You won't see any discussion of the kings of the north, only the kings of the south. But you can read more about his life there, and from about 2 Chronicles 16 through about 18 or 19, you can learn a lot about a lot more details. So he comes to the throne, and it says Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 25 years in Jerusalem, of course, the capital of the south. His mother's name was Azubah, the daughter of Shilhi. And it says, and he walked in the ways of Asa his father. He did not turn aside from it, doing what was right in the sight of the Lord. Yet the high places were not taken away, and the people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places. Jehoshaphat also made peace with the king of Israel. And so he is faithful. Now, when you read the Chronicles, you'll see there's this mixture. This kind of characterizes his life. He has really good, solid moments. And then he has some monumentally bad moments. And so he's walking in the ways of his father. And what he means is, you remember we talked about this when the phrase was first introduced. The kings of the north are usually judged against Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who causes Israel to sin. The kings of the south, on the whole, are judged against David. Asa is the one that's used here. But you remember that those statements had to do with, they're indicative of, if you walk in Jeroboam's shoes, it means you're an idolatrous king. If you walk in David's shoes or Asa's shoes in this particular occasion, it means you were not an idolatrous king. That's the idea, okay? So he does not turn away from the ways of Asa, his father. He is a good king in the sense that he does not promote idolatry. However, there is this statement that says, yet the high places were not taken away. And these high places, many times, you remember, were where they would worship idols. In high places and in groves of trees is where they would participate in their worship. And the people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places. And so it seems like they've been, they're still worshiping in the temple, but they're also worshiping idols, okay? That's what the prophets many times speak out against a lot when you look in the major prophets and the minor prophets, is that they would go and worship God in the temple and act like things were great, and they thought that because they had been to worship in the temple, that meant they were free to do what they wanted to do elsewhere. They had given God basically a nod by saying, I went to worship you, but that doesn't exclude me from worshiping others. And so Jehoshaphat is somewhat criticized here for not removing those high places and taking that option away from the people, okay? And so he's one of these kings. In the north, you have no good kings, okay? None of them were ever good. In the south, you've got bad kings, you've got good kings, and then you've got people like Jehoshaphat that are kind of like so-so. They have some positive things said about them, but also have some negative things said about them. And so that's who he is. Now it says that he made peace with the king of Israel, which was Ahab. Somebody read for us, if you don't mind, 2 Chronicles chapter 18 and verse 1. 2 Chronicles chapter 18 and verse 1. Okay, so when it says he made peace with the king of Israel, he made a marriage alliance with Ahab. So he had their families intermarried, and that's how they created peace. And the way this is worded in the original Hebrew text, it's meant to indicate that Jehoshaphat sought peace with the king, with Ahab, basically. And so he was the weaker king in the negotiation, if that makes sense. So he does it basically to try and protect himself. More so than relying upon God's protection, he turns to a wicked king in Ahab and seeks protection kind of that way, which is a major issue throughout the prophets. God will denounce them for seeking alliances with many nations that are not, instead of trusting God to deliver them in the midst of their difficulties. And so he makes this marriage alliance, and he is the weaker partner in the marriage alliance. That is, Ahab is much stronger than he is. All right, now verse 45. It says, now the rest of the acts of Jehoshaphat, and every time I say his name and see his name, I think, has anybody ever seen the old Robin Hood movie, the cartoon one? Anybody? Drew loved that movie when he was little. The only thing I can think about is Jehoshaphat trigger. Put that pea shooter down. Every time I see his name, I have to kind of fight the urge to say something like that. But anyway, so it says, now the rest of the acts and his might that he showed and how he warred, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Okay, so I think Miss Tammy and I were talking about this week one day when in office hours, and she asked about this, and I thought it was a good question. This phrase, in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah, what does that have reference to? Is that talking about the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, or is it talking about something else? I think it's talking about something else. So what we're doing here in Kings, this is how brief it's being, okay? What we're being told about the kings and what they did during their reigns would be the equivalent of if I handed you one sheet of paper and I said, I want you to summarize President so-and-so's entire administration in this one page. It'd be pretty challenging to do, right? But you could say something else like, I have to give an abbreviated form, but if you want to learn more, you can see their presidential library. You can go to this place and you can see the laws that were passed when they were president and the things that they pushed and things along those lines. You can search it out and learn more information. That's basically what this is saying. They kept records of what their kings did. And so what he's saying, especially to the original reader, is if you want to know more about him, we have history books and record books you can learn about. But as far as it fits the story that we're telling in this book, this is the only information I'm going to give you, because I have a purpose behind why I'm writing. And so that's what's going on, I think, when he says, are they not written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? You can just go check it out and see for yourself. Now in 46, it says, from the land he exterminated the remnant of the male cult prostitutes who remained in the days of Asa his father. All right, now in 1 Kings 15:12, Asa made some headway here and put cult prostitution out of the land to a degree, maybe not fully, obviously, because it still remains a little bit. But cult prostitution was forbidden. Deuteronomy 23, 17 and 18, it was strictly forbidden. And of course, I think we've been through this some, but a lot of idolatry centered around sexual activity, okay? Fertility, because you're in an agricultural society, and so fertility is important, not just of the land, but even just fertility in general. And so they viewed those sexual acts and that fertility, those, if you can even call it that with a straight face, acts of worship, as hopefully what would happen to the ground that it would produce. And so you had priests and priestesses, as they were called, but they were simply prostitutes, the ones who would perform the acts when the, quote, worshipers, if you can say that with a straight face, came to offer their worship in their pagan temples. And so that was done amongst many people, and God had said long before he allowed them to go into the land, that's not going to happen. That should not be allowed. And so Jehoshaphat here is to be praised because he did put an end to that. He put that out of the land. All right? Then we've got verse 47. It says, there was no king in Edom. A deputy was king. So not of the kingly lines or an established reign, but just an influential individual. It says, Jehoshaphat made ships of Tarshish. Tarshish, you remember, is the place where Jonah goes to flee later. In Jonah chapter 1, when God calls him to go to Nineveh, he goes the opposite direction. It was on the coast of Spain. It was a major trading site. And so he says, make ships to go to Tarshish, to go to Ophir for gold, but they did not go, for the ships were wrecked at Ezion-Geber. Okay? So what he's trying to do, if you remember back in chapter 9, verses 26 and 28, and then in chapter 10 and verse 22, Solomon, in the height of his wealth, built these ships. Okay? Ezion-Geber is located on the Gulf of Aqaba. So if you look at a map, probably in the back of your Bible, one of your early ones where you have a more broad scope where you can see Egypt and some other things, you have the Red Sea, and it looks like two fingers coming up out of the Red Sea. Okay? So you have the Gulf of Aqaba and the Gulf of Suez. And so this is located on the Gulf of Suez, a trading port. And Solomon got gold from there and did a number of different things, made a lot of money through that enterprise. And so Jehoshaphat seems to be trying to replicate that, reinstituting it, and bringing some wealth into the nation once again. Verse 49, it says, then Ahazah, the son of Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, let my servants go with your servants in the ships. But Jehoshaphat was not willing. Okay? So Ahaziah, which is the king we're about to read about, he takes over for Ahab. He tries to make a deal with Jehoshaphat, saying, let us go with you and help you, because they had some more experience as sailors than did the people of Judah. They had a connection to Phoenicia. And Jehoshaphat refuses that, which is to his credit. Okay? So Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, his father, and Jehoram, his son, reigned in his place. All right? Let's pause here and look at Chronicles for just a minute, because it gives us a little bit more details about this. 2 Chronicles 20, at the very end of that chapter. 2 Chronicles 20, 35 through 37. It says, after this, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, joined with Ahazah, king of Israel, who acted wickedly. He joined him in building ships to go to Tarshish, and they built ships in Ezion-Geber. This is the first part of what we just read. Then Eleazar prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, because you have joined with Ahaziah, the Lord will destroy what you have made, and the ships were wrecked and were not able to go to Tarshish. And so you see a little bit more information there. That's why it's important when we look at these texts to look at Kings and Chronicles, because we can gain more information. It's kind of like comparing gospel accounts. You learn more information by looking. And so a prophet is speaking against Jehoshaphat's alliance. Now, this is where some of it gets a little tricky, okay? Because it says in verse 50, Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David his father, and Jehoram his son reigned in his place. So there is a Jehoram. If you skip over, where am I looking here? Okay, I can't find it yet. But anyway, we'll come to it in just a minute. We're going to have two kings, both named Jehoram, one over the north and one over the south. Okay? We're going to run into that. And so we have to watch closely and carefully. Which reminds me, I need to get those kings charts printed for you. And so we're going to run into some of that. And some of the kings have multiple names. They have variations to their names. And so we're going to have to watch very closely as we try and make sure we know who we're talking about when we're talking about it. All right, verse 50, or 51, it says, Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, began to reign over Israel in Samaria in the 17th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father, and in the way of his mother, and in the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. He served Baal and worshipped him, and provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger in every way that his father had done. And so basically, he's a carbon copy of his parents. And he says that. He walked in the ways of Ahab, his father, Jezebel, his mother, and Jeroboam, the wicked king from 1 Kings chapter 12, when the kingdom divided, who set up calf worship. And so he's an idolater in every way, and he's no different. That's kind of how the book ends. And remember that the ending here is basically arbitrary. It's just because of the length of scroll. It's not because somehow the story is over here and we're going to pick up something new when we come into 2 Kings. It's just a convenient place to stop, basically. So, any questions or anything on 1 Kings? Ramoth Gilead to go to war over it. It seems like in 1 Kings 20, when he let, let's see, 1 Kings 20 and verse 34, Ben-Hadad said to him, the cities that my father took from your father I will restore, and you may establish bazaars for yourself in Damascus as my father did in Samaria. And so Ben-Hadad made a deal for his life on that occasion, and it seems like Ramoth Gilead was one of those cities that he was supposed to hand back over, but he didn't. And so I think that's why they end up going to war. Good question. All right, anything else? All right. 2 Kings, we're continuing on with where we left off with the story of Ahaziah. All right, somebody, if you don't mind, could you read verses 1 through 4 right now? And we'll take a look at what's going on here. So, continuing the narrative, it says, after the death of Ahab, Moab rebelled against Israel, which is not uncommon. When one king dies, some of the nations or the people that they control many times will rebel to kind of test and see if the new king will be as strong as the previous one. And so they're just kind of testing the waters. Now that's kind of a side note. It will come back in 2 Kings 3. We'll look at that in more detail of what happened and the conflict that will resolve that. But it's just mentioned in passing here that Moab has rebelled. Okay? Now we're told that Ahazah fell through the lattice in the upper chamber in Samaria. And so he's obviously got a multiple-story palace, which has been discovered by archaeologists. And so he falls through the lattice, or the Hebrew word is really ambiguous, so it's kind of hard to nail down exactly what's going on here. But some kind of, he fell out of the window, basically, and from the second story and hit the ground. And the lattice obviously did not hold him. And so he is laying sick on his bed due to this fall. And so he sent messengers telling them, go to inquire of Belzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover from this sickness. Okay, so Ekron is one of the lordship cities of the Philistines. Okay, so the Philistines had 5 major lordship cities. You had Gaza, Gath, Ashkelon, Ekron, and I don't remember the other one, Ashdod maybe. So you had 5 majors. I should know that because I had a teacher who put that on every test we ever took. Seriously, I mean, he taught us Bible geography in the first quarter, and then we'd be studying Hebrews, and it'd be a question about the 5 lordship cities of the Philistines. I don't know, he's obsessed with that question or something. And you'd think I'd know it by now, but I don't. So Ekron is one of the 5 major lordship cities of the Philistines. And so what is he doing, basically, when he's going to... We'll talk about Belzebub here in a minute, but so what is he doing? That's it. He's turning anywhere but to God for the answer to this question. God has proven himself that he can heal the sick, he can raise the dead, he can care for every need that is possible. That's been proven in the last 25 years as far as this text is concerned when you look at the ministry of Elijah. But he turns and he goes to a pagan, idolatrous country to inquire of their gods whether he's going to recover, instead of inquiring of God whether he would recover. Now, Belzebub. So there are 2 theories about Belzebub, and I'm not sure which one is right, to be honest with you. And nobody really is. So the problem is this. Well, I shouldn't say problem, because it's not really. Outside of the Bible, we see no archaeological discoveries to this point of any mention of Belzebub. Okay? Baal, Balaam, the Baals, we see that stuff everywhere. We don't see any mention of, as is mentioned here, Belzebub. Okay? So, now again, I said that's to this point. They're still digging every day in Palestine, and they find stuff all the time. It's not problematic. For years, people thought that the Bible was false because they were the only ones who mentioned the Hittites. And then we discovered inscriptions with the Hittites on them. And so, but anyway, so there are 2 theories. The word Belzebub means Lord of the Flies, basically. Okay? Lord of the Flies. Now, that is interpreted in one of 2 ways. It's either interpreted as, you should take it as at face value. It means he's the Lord of the Flies because, and flies being more all-encompassing than we might think about the little annoying fly, like mosquitoes and other things as well. And that because those little mosquitoes and other things could carry diseases, right? And so if he is the Lord of the flies and they transport diseases, especially as they understood it at that time, then you can see why he's called the Lord of the Flies. because he would be the one in their mind who could control diseases. And you can see why Ahaziah might want to reach out to him on this occasion, because he considered him to be a god who could help with disease or sickness or something along those lines. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that the writer of Kings is basically making a mockery of Baal. Okay? So Belzebub is it's basically taking a shot at Belzebul. We do have reference to Belzebul, Zebul, which means Baal is the prince. So basically he's just taking the name and making a mockery of it. Illustration would be this. In intertestament history, there was a king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who gave Israel a lot of trouble. Now, Epiphanes, you can hear it, Epiphany, is manifest God, basically is what it means. The Jews in jest called him Epimedes, which meant madman. So you see, they just take the word and they just amend it just a little bit in jest toward him, okay? So other people believe that's what's happening here, that the writer of Kings is basically taking the name of Belzebul and changing it just a little bit, Belzebub, Lord of the Flies, and taking a shot at that god. Now, that is certainly possible. Now, you remember in the New Testament, Satan is called by this name, Belzebub. Jesus mentions it in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 25. That's not the only place. There are plenty of other places. And that may have been just based upon the fact that it was associated with idolatry. And idolatry, of course, is satanic in its nature. And that's why the association was there. But anyway, those are the two theories behind Belzebub. I really don't know. Both of them, in my mind, are very plausible. Either way, the main point of the text is he's going to the wrong source. He should have gone to God to ask for information. So he asked the question, shall I recover from the sickness? Verse 3. But the angel of the Lord, which we've talked about quite some time, a pre-incarnate Christ, he's communicating. He said to Elijah the Tishbite, arise, go up to meet the messengers. Now Elijah, of course, has been, we've only seen him every so often since his issues in 1 Kings 19. We saw him in 21 of 1 Kings. He's absent in 22, but now he's present again here. So he sends him and says, meet the messengers of a king of Samaria and say to them, is it because there is no God in Israel that you go to inquire of Belzebub, the god of Ekron? And so basically, just cut them off and don't let them go, and stop them in their tracks and just ask them the question. Okay? Now, Ekron from Samaria would have been about 60 miles southwest. And so he sends Elijah and says, basically, just cut them off and ask them this question. Is it because there is no God in Israel? Obviously, it's rhetorical in its nature. Verse 4, now therefore, thus says the Lord, you shall not come down from your bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die. So Elijah went. Now, that's the message of God to Ahaziah, is you will not recover. And the implication seems to be that he might have, had he not inquired to Belzebub. And what's interesting, and I didn't really pay it much attention when I first read it, but one writer gave it a pretty good discussion and was pretty convincing in the way that he framed it, was this statement at the end. It says, but you shall surely die. That's a phrase pretty common in the Old Testament to describe God's judgment against sin. If you think about it, just go back to the very beginning, Genesis 2:17. On the day you eat of it, you will surely die. And so the statement that he makes here about this judgment is that it may be that the fall itself and the issues of the fall weren't what killed him, but God actually killed him for his unfaithfulness. Now, obviously, to the naked, unobserving eye, it would seem like he died from the fall. But ultimately, God was going to take his life from him for his sin. Okay? So that's kind of the situation at hand. We'll hit the pause button right there, and hopefully next week pick up and see what happens in the process. But so you can see Ahazah is no different than his parents. He's doing the same thing, and he's going everywhere except to God to find the answers to what he needs. And I think there's a big lesson for us in that, right? Now, obviously, you can't be foolish in the application of it. That would be like saying, I know that I'm sick, but I'm not going to go to doctor. I'm going to trust God to heal me. Well, there's a difference between common sense. We've developed good doctors in medicine who can help us, and not trusting, and that's not a lack of trust in the Lord. That's using resources that God has put in front of you, okay? And so in this occasion, in this setting, it does teach us a lot, though, because many times, myself included, we're tempted to turn to other people's advice and other people's writings and other things instead of turning to God first and letting him inform us of what we need to be doing. So, any questions or anything? Yes, sir. He would have been an idol. I mean, they would have had an idol of him. He would have been basically a spiritual being in their minds anyway. But they would have had an idol, I would assume. All right.